Welcome to episode 33 of Anchored in Education. I'm E. Scott England, and Anchored in Education is the podcast dedicated to all things education. Educators across the world routinely engage in conversations surrounding fundamentals, concepts, and new ideas that improve this great profession. Sometimes we agree, other times we disagree. But at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education. A few weeks ago, Joe Sanfilippo made it clear on how important students were to education.
Like, none of us have jobs if they're not there.
During that episode, we scratched the surface of how important it was to include students however and whenever we can. That was to serve as a prelude to today's episode. You might remember Mike Lubelfeld and Nick Polyak. It might just help if I say Mike and Nick. They were on several months ago talking about The Unlearning Leader. Shortly after The Unlearning Leader was released, Mike and Nick partnered again, but this time they added another co-author. The third author is Dr. PJ Caposey. PJ serves as the superintendent of Meridian Community Unit School District number 223 in Stillman Valley, Illinois. The three of them teamed up to write a powerful book called Student Voice, From Invisible to Invaluable. This book is chock full of ideas as to how we can incorporate students into our everyday and into the decisions we make in education. Today, I'm joined by Mike and PJ. Nick originally planned on joining us, but he was needed in his district. I'm pretty sure, though, my two guests can fill the gaps. Mike, welcome back to Anchored in Education, and PJ, welcome for the first time.
Great to be here, Scott. Thank you for having us.
Agreed. Thank you for having us.
Hey, so we've had the opportunity to talk more about Mike and Nick and how they became anchored in education. But before we get started here, we'd like to find out a little bit more about you, PJ, and how you became anchored in education.
Yeah, I'd love to kind of share the origin story. I was very fortunate to have kind of the perfect upbringing with two supportive parents, was naturally gifted at school, loved my school experience, but I didn't find much need for teachers. I was just very blessed in that way. When I was 17 years old, I was diagnosed with cancer and ended up having to be homebound tutored for an extended period of time. And at that point, a handful of my teachers went way above and beyond in ensuring that they could still deliver the content of AP and dual credit classes, at which point my homebound tutor would not have been able to do so. And so at that point, I realized that teachers really have the power to change trajectory of lives. Up until that point, I was just ignorant to that. And so as soon as I kind of regained health, I knew that I wanted to go into education. Started my career in the inner city of Chicago, moved on to assistant principal in urban setting in Rockford. Okay. And now my last two spots have been rural education, and I'm at Meridian 223 as superintendent in the 7th year right now.
What an incredible story. And props and shout outs to the rural educators out there. Sorry, Mike, but that's my brothers out there. So
I'll give them props and shout outs as well. Absolutely, Scott.
All right. So today brought you guys in. Actually, so this is kind of a special treat. We are we're together. This is not phone. We are joined up for the annual IASA conference. We met in Springfield. We've commandeered the executive boardroom here for a little bit, and we did so we could talk about the book that you co-authored together along with Nick Polyak, Student Voice. And I think, honestly, though, my favorite part of this book is the subtitle, which is From Invisible to Invaluable. And so when did it strike you that our profession had too many adult voices that were simply drowning the voices of students?
I had a very specific moment where I realized that, and it was after my first year as principal of Oregon High School, made dramatic changes in just about every way that you can think possible. And I remember a very gifted student, like a unicorn of a student, incredible athlete, incredible brilliance, incredible leader, came into my office and said, "You know what, Mr. Caposey, I really appreciate what you're trying to do at this school," and it felt amazing. And she goes, "But everything changed. It would have been nice if somebody would have asked us."
Oh, wow.
And at that point, I realized that I neglected our number one customer in getting input and at least communicating the vision for what I had as to what school could look like. And at that point, I realized I needed to do something different.
Wow. Mike?
Well, I'll tell you, when I was about to become the superintendent of schools in the Deerfield Public Schools in Lake County, Illinois, this must be about 7, 8 years ago, I was at a school board meeting, and the retiring superintendent mentioned that they were going to be doing away with French, the world language of French. And there was gasps in the audience, and this must have been about April, and I was going to take the seat in July. And so I'm walking out of the board meeting with the board president, and he said, "Mike, what do you think about getting rid of French?" I said, "Well, sir, I'm in general not really in favor of getting rid of electives or creative or world language." I said, "I'm going to need to know the history. Is this something that the board supports?" And he's like, "Well, I don't know." He said, "This seems kind of hot." I go, "Do me a favor. Just tell him the new guy will figure it out and take care of it." And he said, "Okay." A few months went by, and then my leadership team and I said, "Well, instead of just looking at French at the middle schools, perhaps we should look at some other areas." Long story short, we created the Superintendent's Task Force for Middle Level Education, and one of the cornerstones of this task force was the participation of teachers and administrators and parents and students. So I was blessed with a wonderful leadership team. We had the vision to trust and entrust decisions to students, and we started making large-scale leadership changes with students at the table.
Wow. And I think the most important thing that we heard there, and students, because before, I think it's always been, we talk about the community members, we talk about the board members, and for those that were really, really advanced at one point, we brought in the parents, and we said, this is your child's education. What do you want to see? But you're right, and PJ, our number one customer, we would always exclude them from these decisions that, like you're talking about, Mike, are huge. And so I got to give you a quick moment of truth, though. Whenever I first saw the book, I reflected back to my days teaching first grade. And I knew I listened to the students, I really did, and I listened to their voices in many aspects of our school year, including giving them a say in how and what we learned. So my first thought was, this was not the book for me. So apologies, but of course, I couldn't resist, opening it and looking at the table of contents, and I quickly saw that student voice in the classroom is just a small fraction of the opportunities to provide students the chance to have a say in education. So can we talk for a minute on how students can be included in almost every part of the educational process?
Absolutely. I'll tell you something funny is the students helped us make a lot of really big decisions, and including we kept French and we added foreign languages based on the input. One of the things we made a mistake about, though, was we redesigned science labs, and in phase one, we had all this really cool, funky, fancy furniture, but guess what? They were sixth grade science labs, and we realized that the seats that were these high tops that could go down, the children didn't weigh enough to drop them. In our first go-around, we didn't have students even check out the chairs. And this may sound kind of silly, but really, it's their classroom, it's their world.
Yeah.
Every subsequent classroom redesign and furniture effort, including phase two, involves students physically being involved and mentally being involved to help us make decisions. They became equal players and equal partners in the design process, the furniture process, the technology process, even in some pedagogy process. And it really opened my eyes to say there's no limit to where students should be involved. And I want to give a quick shout out to the youngsters who helped us write this book. We've got Darius from PJ's district. We've got Noel and Mike and Charlie from Nick's district. And we have Kyla Guru from my district. And Kyla was a student who we selected to be the keynote speaker of a parent education night. First time ever we had a student really taking the risk, taking a chance, getting the students involved. It has completely changed my view on education and leadership.
Oh, and you mentioned your students, helpers or authors. We're actually going to talk here towards a little bit about Darius from PJ's district.
Wonderful.
And, so I don't want to give that away, but an incredible story coming out of Stillman Valley there. So, I'm sorry, PJ, did you have anything to add? I'm forgetting about.
Sure. I would just say that the number one thing I think that holds us back is fear. And I think that we just have to think about the things that we're afraid to relinquish control of. And as we ascend to leadership, whether it's leadership of our own classroom, leadership of our department, building, or district, a lot of times we assume that comes with additional control, and it just comes with additional responsibility. And once we realize that that control is not ours, like we get the privilege of leading and serving and guiding the ship. But if we're not including the voice of students, the only reason we can go back to is either we make excuses based on their level of maturity, which are just factually inaccurate if we look at it deeper. The only thing we're fearful of giving up that control. And so I just encourage in literally every aspect of, from we have kids that sit at our board table and talk with our board members about real, meaningful, deep issues, to all of our buildings having student advisory councils the same way that we have parent advisory councils, is that the feedback that we've gotten has not been radical. It hasn't been, we want easier curricula, like it's not those things that you think it's going to be. It's actual, real, meaningful change that they have the courage to jump right into, that sometimes we dance around. So it's just, again, if anything, relinquish control, lean into the fear of what might be, and just let kids be amazing.
And I think relinquishing control is where we find ourselves struggling. In fact, you kind of allude to that at the back of the book when we get into teacher evaluation, but I'm going to get to that in just a second. There's something about student voice I feel that we must unlearn, and that is that students are just there to listen and learn. So Joe Sanfilippo was on Anchored in Education a few weeks ago, and he said, without students, none of us have jobs. And so I don't have Nick here. He talked about this, but PJ, you just alluded to it, so I'm going to throw this one to you. Student members on the Board of Education, their advisory roles, but how does this shift conversations at board meetings?
Dramatically. So I have found that even significantly better than I can do, our students can steer conversation. And when they articulate what their real experience is, as opposed to the experience that I think our board members, while like incredibly well-intentioned, they project their experiences onto today's students. And what we know is that school has radically changed, society has radically changed. So in our district, and this is 5 years ago, the conversation of allowing cell phones was, burgeoning, and the board was somewhat reluctant to it. And so we had our student advisory. At that point, they weren't sitting at the table, but they were an active committee that reported monthly to the board, and they were advocating for the use of cell phones in schools. And all of our board members at that time not only had their computer open, but also had their cell phone with them on the table. And the student member called that out.
Oh, nice.
Said, in the most professional setting we have in our district, everyone is at least 2-to-1, device plus cell. And you're saying that in the educational setting that's not appropriate. And within about 2 meetings, cell phones were allowed. So the ability to steer conversation, I think, is paramount. The dynamic at the table, I think my board has been incredibly respectful and thoughtful about how they approach things. So the dialogue really hasn't changed, except what typically would happen is a board member would voice a concern, opinion, thought, and then they'd look to me for guidance in the past. And before they look to me for my thoughts on it, they always turn to the student and say, how does this impact you? And instead of just having the mission statement, which is great, up there and referring to that, actually having student voice on each critical issue discussed, articulated, is pretty impressive in how it impacts our board members. But it's just also awesome to watch 17, 18-year-old kids be able to conduct themselves so professionally and on behalf of their constituents. That just fills me with joy. Like that is what we're trying to accomplish.
Well, and that really adds in an aspect that kids haven't had the opportunity to have before, that they're going to face in the real world. They may not be on a board of education, they may not be on a board, but there's a good chance at some point they're going to be in a meeting. They're going to be in some kind of staffing. It could even be an interview. Knowing how to conduct yourself in this professional manner, it provides lessons that we're not doing in classrooms as well. Am I right on that?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think you're seeing more and more pockets where students are being educated in learning environments where their voices do matter, and where they're able to show they can choose how to demonstrate what they're learning, and they can choose how to show their talents off and show their interests. And I think there's more and more schools like PJ's and Nick's that are having student members with their voice literally at the board table. I think there's more of it, yet I want to go back to what PJ said. It really is fear, and I appreciate the unlearning shout out, Scott.
I snuck that in there.
That was good. We have to unlearn some of the old routines and rituals and placements of where people belong, so to speak. I think we all belong at the table.
Well, and if I'm pretty certain somewhere in the student voice book, I mean, you mentioned unlearning, but I mean, that's essentially it. That this is a huge part of getting student voice in there is taking away what PJ had talked about, the relinquishing control. So, but now, Mike, so you're no stranger to podcasts. The Lighthouse 112. That's your district podcast that serves to update the community. And I think it would probably surprise no one if I were to say that you often have students join you on the podcast to deliver updates and share experiences. Now, I'm guessing this probably takes more time for scheduling, the balancing of schedules between yours and students and teachers and everything else. And so it probably is not far out there to say that it would be far easier just to share those updates and everything yourself. But a whole other element is added when you bring students into the sharing process. So explain how the content becomes richer and more meaningful by adding students to this podcast.
Well, I'll tell you, I have the utmost respect for our students, and I have a great deal, the utmost respect for our teachers, too, who allow me to go into their classrooms, allow me to meet with the students. Our principals facilitate it. I will say that I may be interesting and fascinating. Others may argue that. PJ may argue that.
I won't argue it.
Thank you, Scott.
No comment.
And Nick would definitely argue that. I want to say the content, though, is far more valuable, all kidding aside, to our community when they hear it unedited, unfiltered, unscripted from the students themselves. When I talk with the students, I give them an idea of what the content will be, and the only guidance is just say what's on your mind, tell the truth. And I have to say that I'm always impressed with the thoughtful and articulate nature of our students of all ages who have participated in things ranging from our Portrait of a Graduate work, which is brand new.
Okay.
It's under the leadership of Jason Williams and other administrators and parents and students and teachers in our district. We had students explain to us the process of the Modern Learning Committee, the process of their voice being used to help create the profile of a graduate. We talked about students in a passion project in English language arts, and I'll continue to chat with the students about what's on their mind, and I think it's really healthy for our organization to hear from their voices so I can practice what I preach.
Well, and absolutely, and so, I can tell community members that, we've got robotics, we've got coding, we've got drones, we've got all that, and don't get me wrong, they're like, oh, that sounds a whole lot different than whenever I was in school. It sounds like they're getting a lot of great opportunities. But when I take students to Rotary with robotics, and then they're the ones that's like, oh, Scott has the program. No. These students had the program. Let them tell you. All of a sudden, it's like, okay, we want to invest more into what we're seeing. And we're sharing the exact same story. They're just not hearing it from me. So maybe, Mike, that does speak to both of us are not very entertaining, and we should really hand the whole thing over to students. But I've got a daughter probably ready to take over the podcast, so we won't get onto that. We alluded to this earlier, quite possibly. One of the coolest stories to come out of this book, in my opinion, can be found towards the end of chapter 6, and it was the guest commentary written by a student from your district, PJ. I can't recap the entire story, but I'll give a quick summary. That student, a freshman at the time, reached out about a project that he was working on outside of school, and just kind of shared it to the Facebook page, just looking for feedback, looking for clicks. Something. Yeah. and so... and if I remember right from the book, the student's family even said, don't waste their time, but he did it anyway. And then he said, within 2 hours, you had responded back to him. You noticed that the passion and the talent immediately, you brought this young man in to talk more. And this simple gesture led this student to have a full-fledged business up and going, if I understood right, before even graduating. So then I did some research, and if it's correct, he's still a successful entrepreneur in video production, putting out some beautiful, I think he did 2019 graduation at Stillman Valley, and just amazing videography and weddings and everything else. So could you talk to us a little bit about how listening to student voice can open up doors for everyone involved.
Absolutely. So the student's name was Darush. We call him D because Darush is so hard to say.
Okay.
So he reached out via email, and I had just started in the district, so I didn't have a good grasp of who all the students were. And I watched his production, and as a father, it spoke to me as to how much reverence he conducted as he basically went with his father on an over-the-road trucking trip over his Christmas breaks and then did a documentary on the hard work that over-the-road trucking was. So the fact that a student had the understanding and respect for their father to understand what they were doing was heartwarming to me. And I said, yeah, come on in. I'll help you in any way I can. And he walks in, and he was a big kid and incredibly articulate. And I said to him, like, man, it'd be awesome if we could use your services for longer, but I don't think we're going to have you for very long. And he's like, I'm only a freshman, Mr. C. I just thought he was older, the way he was conducting himself. And I'm like, I've got lots of ideas that we can go through. And so we leveraged his talents as many ways as we could. We were creative in trying to figure out ways to get him credit for the work that he did. But what he did for us was provide us an opportunity to really embrace and go in an area that we weren't strong in terms of video and digital. And what we gave him was we showcased his talents. And so he was able to leverage that into, he's done weddings now for several of our staff members as their videographer. And he's just leveraged it into a whole side career for him. He wants to be a fireman.
Okay.
This is all side work for him as well. So just a really incredible story. He drove by far the best car in the parking lot by the end of high school with all the side work that he did. So he did quite well for himself, but incredibly motivated, incredibly driven. But for us, it was simply just saying yes, right? Like the power of yes is I didn't know where it was going to go.
Right.
I remember going to the board and I said, look, we're using you a lot more than we're giving you in terms of credit. I feel bad, like we're taking advantage. And I said, so what could we do to help you outside of paying you? Because obviously it'd be weird to pay a student. Right. There'd be lots of conflicts of interest there. Yeah. He's like, could we buy a better camera that the district just owns that I could use for the camera? And so we were able to work that out. And then he was able to purchase it for $1 when he graduated. So we got 4 years of service out of it. So it was a great partnership both ways.
And I think that the message not conveyed here is that maybe nothing comes of this. Let's go back to he reaches out with this video and nothing comes of it, but you at least recognize and say, thanks for sharing. I mean, that would have had a whole lot. Now, obviously, your story of reaching out and putting him to work turned out very cool, but I think that's what we forget, that there's a student that outside of school did all of this work, has a clear passion, and then of all people think to share it with our educators. And that's what, when we hear that student voice, we have to respond in some way, because you don't know what it'll lead. In your case, it led to something that's been phenomenal for both of you.
Well, I think it needs to go further, right? Like I think it needs to transform what we do. So I speak a lot on using social media as a school leader, and number one thing that comes back is time. And I was like, use your kids. They're better at it than you are already.
True.
They have a true voice. There's authenticity. So just in almost everything that we find, that it'd be awesome to do this if we only had the time. Our number one underutilized resource is the talent of our students. And not to speak poor of traditional curricula, but the stuff that they're interested in that we want to get done that we don't have time to do because it doesn't fit in our traditional bucket, they typically are skilled in and passionate about. And if we leverage those things, kids may just enjoy school a heck of a lot more than they do in the traditional setting.
Oh, absolutely. And a lot of what you're talking about coming up in a month on Anchored in Education, we're going to have Trevor McKenzie talking about his book, Diving into Inquiry. And it's essentially, it's this, for, when they get to the end of whether it be junior or senior year, they can explore their passion. It also serves what the school is trying to do because it aligns, because they've got to that point. But we have some talented students. I know up in North Shore you do, and Fairfield we do, at Stillman Valley, well, it's Meridian. Meridian Unit District there, 223.
Yes,
so shout out there. And then we can't forget Leiden 212, even though Nick is not with us right now. But we've got talented students throughout, and geographically, you all are pretty close. I think 80 miles maybe separate Mike and PJ.
Yeah.
And but then you've got me way down there. But there's talented students no matter where we are at. So before we go, let's talk about the last chapter. And I said we'd talk about this because I think this is where people are going to be reading, and then all of a sudden they're going to stop and they're going to be like, hold up. I'm not ready for this. And we're talking about student voice in part of the teacher evaluation. So, I'm all for student voice is what they're going to say, but let's stop before they start evaluating teachers. Now, I don't think that's what you're saying in this book, that they're not going to take over the evaluation process. But you even have, I wish I would have marked the page, you have a whole excuse elimination section in here because it's the things that were going through my head. But we're not talking about students evaluating teachers as the be-all, end-all. Rather, we're talking about students providing quality feedback to teachers and how we can make learning experiences for students even better. You concede at the end that we've made improvements, but we do not have it right yet. And so what are some ways or steps we can begin taking to get this right and make this a valuable part of the educational experience?
Well, I'll start, and then if PJ wants to go, PJ's an expert in evaluation, coaching, guidance, teachers, administrators. He's superb. So I'll start, and then I'll let him close with some of the wisdom.
That's a big task, PJ. Get ready.
I just gave him $100.
In my experiences over the last couple of years in a couple of different districts, I have sought the voice of students on an engagement survey. So all children in grades 3 through 8, whether it's in English or Spanish, whatever language it needs to be in, conduct a survey, and they give us an index as to how engaged and satisfied they are in learning. There's dimensions like the survival dimension. Are they well fed? Do they feel well rested? Those are important things for us to know and hear their voice. We also have dimensions of choice and relevance. Choice, not in what they're learning, but choice instead in how they are able to demonstrate what they've learned. And when students are asked in grades 3 through 8, in my experiences, over year after year after year, they're quite clear and they're quite powerful and they're quite proud in what it means to have a learning environment where their voice is heard in terms of providing choices so they can demonstrate how they've learned. So one of the ways that we're looking at evaluation is systems evaluation, or macro or large scale, where we aggregate the student responses, all grades, or we separate it by grade level. It's not an individual evaluation. It's a starting point to create a system and a structure whereby their voices are heard, and then as a system we can respond to those themes. One thing could be, for example, if children are tired all the time at a particular grade level, maybe we rethink our start and end times and bring students to that table. In my case, with this example of choice, we bring students to the table in a modern learning committee, and they discuss and have dialogue about pedagogy and what's going on in the classroom with the teachers. I think their voice is essential. I think their voice is powerful. Each child has but 1 year to experience whatever grade level they're in, PK through 12 and beyond. And I think it's incumbent upon us as the leaders to bring them in and embrace them and make their voices go from invisible to invaluable as we make decisions together. And now we'll turn it over to the real expert on evaluation, PJ Caposey.
Well, thank you. That said, the survey that Mike was talking about, he has shared with my district, and we have adopted as well. So as much leadership and guidance in this area that he gave me credit for, he exhibits as well. So evaluation is a passion project for me, just because I think it's when we break down, if we did a classification of where we spend time versus where we actually have impact, I think that evaluation, we spend an enormous amount of time, and I think we have a net negative impact. I think it has a negative cultural impact. I don't think that we're doing as much to improve instruction with it as we can. And so if we just look very deeply in the mirror there, we would realize, okay, we have a system that's flawed and broken, and we have to do something to turn it around and make it meaningful. One of the options is to include student voice, and to be very transparent, I have not been able to lead my district to get us to a place where we're including this in a systematic fashion yet. So a lot of what was written there is like a manifesto of like where I hope to eventually be. But the data and the research is relatively clear that if we're looking at whether administrators can go in and provide meaningful evaluation compared to students providing the evaluation, the students are much more predictive of student performance. Meaning that if we have a teacher that's demonstrating really positive data year over year over year, the students are much more likely to rate that teacher higher than the administrator is, which means that, shockingly, somebody that spends 175 days with somebody has a better ability to rate their effectiveness than somebody that spent 90 minutes with them. And so when we just think about the math of it, it is absurd that we're not doing this in more systematic fashion.
I agree. Well said, PJ.
That was very well said, and it's something that as I'm listening to both of you describe what you have going on, I don't want listeners thinking, they're light years ahead of us and get discouraged. I think that in the end of today's episode, the message is just listen to students. That previously in the model of education that we've known, they've been invisible. What we have found over the years and what you've highlighted in this book is that they're truly invaluable. And so if we can just put them as part, listen to them, and use that to not only make our schools better, but to make us better as individuals, I think we all win. So, and we all remain anchored in education. So shout out to my own podcast.
There we go.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank
for
you.
having us.
Honored to be here. Thank you.
These guys are absolutely fantastic. Follow Mike and PJ on Twitter today at Mike Lubelfeld and at MCUSDSUPE. Of course, let's not forget Nick. You can find him by searching at in Polyak. Before I close, don't forget to visit escottengland.com and click on the Read More link to read more about Mike, Nick, and PJ, as well as find a link to Student Voice. And don't forget to subscribe to Anchored in Education on whatever platform you get your podcasts on. Students are absolutely vital to education. We've mentioned it several times today. Yet, I'm going to ask you to reflect on your most recent day or week in the classroom. How many decisions were made that could have included student voice, but for convenience or time, we made the decision ourselves? It happens more than we'd probably care to admit. In fact, I'll take it one step further and say that I am probably guilty of this both as an educator and as even a parent. But recognizing our deficiencies and making necessary corrections is what makes us better educators. We should always be evaluating and adjusting what we do. For example, if I were to go back to the classroom teaching first grade, I think about the newsletter I would do. I used to do a weekly newsletter to let parents know what was coming up. Why not have the students help with this? Or why not have them do a monthly recap of what we've been learning? As a principal, I would have students help determine what our character traits should be instead of having an adult committee. And as a superintendent, I would utilize student voice more to help drive district decisions and inform the community. There is something we all can do. We owe it to ourselves to start doing something now, because at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education.